So Florida has monkeys, specifically these kinds of monkeys, and these, and even a little bit of these. So how did 3 different species of monkey manage to colonize the state of Florida independently from each other? Well, with each of these different monkeys coming into the state separate from each other, the real story behind how they got here is quite bananas. So let's go over once and for all how these monkeys are affecting Florida's ecosystems, on top of where exactly they can be found, and how they're going to affect Florida's residents going forward.
Dozens of vervet monkeys living less than a mile from Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport. These
and it's raining monkeys.
Airport in Dania Beach when a man walked up to this. But guess what? He says he wasn't surprised because
it's a monkey invasion.
They're vicious, they're extreme, they get extremely nasty.
For starters, we have by far Florida's most numerous primate species, besides humans of course, and also probably its most aggressive primate species, also besides humans, that being the rhesus macaque. Macaques themselves are incredibly well known for being the sorts of monkeys that steal your phone and also punch the monkey. Justice for him, by the way. But rhesus macaques in particular are fairly dangerous for one main reason, that being the fact that they carry an incredibly deadly strain of herpes, which is known for having a 40% fatality rate on humans. So if you do see these monkeys, please do not touch them. Luckily for the general public, these monkeys are really only abundant in one county, that being Marion County, which contains about 600 of these guys. This part of Florida is a hotspot for these monkeys as it is their original introduction site. So how exactly did these monkeys get to the state of Florida? Well, originally these macaques were imported from Southeast Asia and were brought over to the Silver Spring State Park. They were then dumped onto one of the islands within the spring, with the goal of these monkeys being to attract tourists, as the original plan for Silver Spring State Park was to make it a Tarzan-themed attraction, which I can't really blame them, the park is quite gorgeous. But you see, there was one huge problem with this plan. These monkeys could swim. How some rich imbecile back in the 1930s came up with the idea of releasing 6 monkeys onto an island within the middle of Florida just to have them swim off and then replace them with another 6 monkeys is beyond me. Regardless, after this whole fiasco occurred, a total of 12 monkeys would essentially be released within Florida's wilderness. Luckily for these macaques, a lot of people actually adored them and would regularly give them food. And on top of this, these macaques are fairly generalistic with their diet and habitat preferences, which allowed for them to adapt to Central Florida's climate quite easily. Despite this, it would still take many decades for their population to truly boom. This was mainly because it would take a little while for these macaques to adjust to the new predators that would be found within Silver Spring State Park. Sure, these monkeys are capable of swimming, but there's no way they stand any chance in outswimming an American alligator. On top of reports of alligators picking off these monkeys, car collisions and even otter attacks would also help to slow down the rhesus macaque's population growth within Central Florida. Believe it or not though, during the later half of the 1900s, there would be more releases of these rhesus macaques, with these additional temporary smaller populations coming from zoos that would end up getting hit by hurricanes, allowing for these monkeys to escape with relative ease. Thankfully, due to their smaller numbers, these monkey populations would almost always end up returning to captivity. But there was one other colony that was successful for over 30 years that would go mostly under the radar within the Florida Keys. This population was not made up of escapees, but rather was a population purposely set up by a laboratory which wanted to experiment on these monkeys. These experiments would be relatively short-lived as the monkeys would essentially destroy the island's vegetation and native wildlife, leading to the removal of these monkeys only 30 years after they were put on Lois Key. Funnily enough, while the removal was mostly successful, as stated before, these monkeys can swim, and somehow, either these monkeys made a boat, or a select few of them were able to make the over 1 mile swim to the main chain of the lower Florida Keys, where they would be sighted all the way up until the late 2000s in very small numbers. So while the Florida Keys was able to rid itself of these monkeys, the same cannot exactly be said about Silver Spring State Park. After being around for about 70 years, once the turn of the century came, these monkeys were numbering in the high hundreds and possibly even the thousands within Marin County. Not just have they taken over Silver Spring State Park to become the dominant medium-sized mammal, but they were also starting to invade other parts of central Florida, including some of the surrounding counties. This would eventually lead to over 1,000 of these monkeys being removed by the Florida government within the span of about 20 years. This removal process was fairly controversial, as on one hand these monkeys were destroying the surrounding ecosystem on top of also attacking people. But on the other hand, a lot of people found them to be absolutely adorable. In a way, part of people's disdain for how these animals were removed is justified, as a lot of these monkeys were inevitably euthanized, or even worse, some of them were brought over to abusive labs where they would be experimented upon prior to their deaths. But hey, if it makes any of you psychos feel any better, a few people in these labs were actually killed by these monkeys due to the fatal strand of herpes that they carry. This, in an ironic twist of fate, would help save more of these monkeys from being captured. Thankfully, not a single person has died from this virus outside of these labs in the state of Florida, at least so far. Now in modern day, about 600 of these monkeys remain, with the vast majority of them being concentrated around their original home in Silver Spring State Park. Still, their population is steadily increasing, with sightings of them on trail cameras and by local residents occurring as far north as Gainesville and as far south as Orlando on the occasion. Does this mean we'll be getting these rhesus macaques invading some of Florida's cities in the near future? Probably not, but it's always a concerning yet fascinating possibility. But what if I told you there was another species of monkey that actually has been invading one of Florida's cities for a very long time now, and these monkeys actually do live relatively close to my own home. Only about half an hour from Miami, you could actually find not one but two other species of monkey, with the more common of the two being the green monkey. These primates were once thought to be vervet monkeys, but after some recent DNA testing, we now know that they're primarily green monkeys, with these primates also likely containing some trace DNA from other closely related monkey species. So if you haven't already figured it out, these creatures get their name from the green fur they have and not their black skin. To be honest, I think they're way cuter than the macaques. The main reason why these guys don't get as much publicity as the macaques is actually because they're a lot less aggressive and exist in much smaller numbers. These creatures originally started their population in 1948 when they escaped from a local primate zoo. Luckily for the owners of this zoo, it was only the green monkeys that escaped. Because oh my god, imagine if a chimpanzee were to escape. That would be I'd probably move out of the state, to be honest. Now getting back to the green monkeys, when they originally escaped, their population was only about 12 to 15 individuals, and this population wouldn't grow much primarily due to all of the surrounding development. Now in modern day, only about 60 of these monkeys remain in Fort Lauderdale and Dania Beach. The monkeys themselves are separated into multiple different troops, so some of them actually being quite friendly around people. This is because just like the macaques, people do feed these monkeys. But unlike the macaques, because of their more friendly nature, these monkeys are more willing to approach people, more so out of curiosity than aggression. While they can be found in multiple different mangrove parks across Fort Lauderdale and Dania Beach, they are by far the most common around the north side of the Fort Lauderdale airport, particularly Snyder Park and one of the random parking lots near the airport's Park and Go parking. Thanks to their smaller population and less destructive habits, these monkeys are actually considered to be much less severe of a threat to Florida's local ecosystems. They've even been found to live alongside other mammals such as Florida's raccoons, which they even have their own unique calls to identify. The truth is, with people regularly feeding these monkeys food items they're not supposed to eat, and us unfortunately hitting them with our cars, we're actually a bigger threat to them than they are to us. In addition to this, with more and more development occurring within Broward County, on top of climate change slowly destroying their habitat due to hurricanes and rising sea levels, the odds of these monkeys continuing to survive in Florida in the near future is getting lower and lower each year. Regardless, some people have been trying to make efforts to keep these monkeys around in order to research them in a somewhat natural habitat. And also due to them being an icon of Dania Beach and Fort Lauderdale, a lot of people want these monkeys to stay. For all of these reasons, there haven't been any government efforts made in order to remove these monkeys, but a handful of trappers have been found capturing and unfortunately selling these monkeys onto the black market. While this is illegal in Florida, and there are conservation groups trying to prevent this from happening, unfortunately this is becoming a more and more common occurrence with both Florida's primates and also its parrot species. At least despite the many obstacles they face, these monkeys have been able to maintain a somewhat stable population within Broward County, which is more than what could be said about the last primate we'll be talking about in this video. So I think we can all agree that squirrel monkeys are absolutely adorable. Because of this, a lot of people would end up trying to keep them as pets, only for them to release these monkeys later or to have these monkeys escape shortly after being bought off the black market. Believe it or not, at their peak there was likely over 100 of these adorable squirrel monkeys living throughout 5 different populations within the state of Florida. But now in modern day, only one of these populations remains for 3 different reasons. The first of which is, unlike the rhesus macaques or the green monkeys, Brazilian squirrel monkeys aren't nearly as adapted to the cold. These creatures originally came from the Amazon, where temperatures would rarely drop below 65 degrees. But in Florida, cold fronts could cause the whole state to drop below 50 degrees for multiple nights on end. And unfortunately, most of these spider monkeys simply weren't able to survive this challenge. On top of this, as most of these monkey populations came from escapees rather than purposeful releases, these monkeys existed in small numbers within each of their populations, making it much easier for people to collect these monkeys and remove them from the wild. The final reason as to why these monkeys aren't more abundant within Florida is actually a combination of competition with Florida's native species, such as raccoons and opossums, and even competition with Florida's other invasive monkeys. Squirrel monkeys are quite small in comparison to rhesus macaques and green monkeys, and this would lead to one of the squirrel monkeys' populations, which actually lived alongside the rhesus macaques within Florida, being wiped out entirely, partially due to their inability to survive alongside their larger primate cousins. Something similar also applies to their last surviving population within Fort Lauderdale. These monkeys got out back in the 1970s, and their population peaked at about 40 individuals, all living within Hugh Birch Taylor State Park. Unlike the other spider monkey populations, such as those that once existed around Naples, Lake Walls, and even my college campus, the squirrel monkeys of Fort Lauderdale were able to learn how to survive the cold fronts by going into many of the man-made buildings, which would help to keep themselves warm during the coldest of Florida's nights. Their population would continue to thrive to some degree until 2012, where a severe cold snap would wipe out a large portion of the squirrel monkeys within Fort Lauderdale. Things would only get worse from there for these small primates, as green monkeys slowly started moving into the already small habitat these squirrel monkeys had for themselves. This introduction of additional larger competition would help to drain down the squirrel monkeys' numbers to where they're at in modern day. Now less than a handful of them remain, all living around the Bonnet House within Hugh Birch Taylor State Park. What is important to keep in mind is that these green monkeys didn't invade the squirrel monkeys' homes on purpose. They ended up moving there due to the increased amount of habitat that was being converted into urban development. What is important to keep in mind is that none of these monkeys chose to invade Florida on their own. Instead, they were put here by us, and we need to learn how to take a greater degree of responsibility for the invasive species we've introduced to not just Florida, but the entire world's different ecosystems. If any of these monkey populations will continue to thrive within Florida remains to be seen. But with how close some of these populations are to my home, I might even make an entirely separate video where I try to visit them. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe, and also hit that hype button, because I try to make animal mini documentaries every single week, and YouTube is my main source of income, so by doing those little things, it means the entire world to me, and with that being said, hopefully I'll see you real soon. Goodbye.